You know, it seems like every day there's another headline about some potential constitutional violation.
Yeah, it's like a constitutional violation a day will keep the democracy away, right?
It really does feel that way. And that's kind of the spirit of what we're looking at today. So today we're deep diving into a First Amendment issue that popped up between the Trump administration and the Associated Press.
Yeah, a really interesting case that gets to the heart of the relationship between the government and the press. So in this case, we have a federal judge, and it's worth pointing out this judge was appointed by President Trump, ruled that the White House acted unlawfully by blocking journalists from the Associated Press.
Unlawfully blocking journalists. Okay,
Okay.
so what was the story that they were trying to block? Like, what was the catalyst for this whole issue?
Well, it actually revolves around a pretty specific point,
Yeah.
but it has much broader implications. So the issue was the name for a body of water.
Mm-hmm.
President Trump consistently used the name Gulf of America, while the Associated Press used the traditional and internationally recognized name Gulf of Mexico. Now, it's important to note, the AP wasn't ignoring the president's preferred name. They acknowledged it in their reporting, but they stuck with their standard usage, especially for their international audience.
So essentially, because of a naming disagreement, the White House restricted access for a major news organization. It's just wild to think about that even being possible. So what's the big question we're tackling in this deep dive? What's at the heart of it all?
The fundamental question here is about the First Amendment and what happens when the government tries to control which journalists can cover them based on the journalist's editorial choices. In this case, it was about word choice. Can the government use access as leverage to pressure news outlets into using the language it prefers?
Wow. So let's get into the judge's ruling then, especially because, as you mentioned, he was a Trump appointee. That just adds this whole other layer to it. What were some of the key points that led him to decide that what the White House did was unlawful?
Yeah, what really stands out in the judge's ruling is how straightforward and clear his reasoning is. He stated very plainly that if the government opens its doors to some journalists,
Mm.
it cannot then shut those doors to other journalists because of those viewpoints. The Constitution requires no less.
Okay.
That's a pretty strong statement about the principle of equal access for the press.
Yeah.
And the judge didn't stop there. He also went on to directly address and shoot down the White House's argument that letting journalists cover the president is a privilege that they can give or take away whenever they feel like it.
So they were basically saying,
He basically said, no, no, no. The court is simply holding that under the First Amendment.
Mm.
Meaning this isn't about doing someone a favor. It's about upholding a fundamental constitutional right.
so the judge was pushing back against this whole idea that it was a privilege to begin with and saying, no, this is about basic rights. It sounds like the White House tried to spin how the AP was asking for access too. What did they say about that?
Yeah. The White House tried to frame it as if the AP was demanding special treatment or some kind of extra access, but the judge wasn't having any of that. He said the government repeatedly characterizes the AP's request as a demand for extra special access. But that is not what the AP is asking for, and it is not what the court orders all the AP wants, and all it gets is a level playing field.
Yeah.
So it's clear the AP wasn't trying to get an advantage. They just wanted the same opportunity to cover the White House as everyone else.
It was all about fairness in their eyes. So what was the official reason the White House gave for barring AP reporters from these events?
Well, according to public statements from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, and Deputy Chief of Staff Taylor Backwich, they all said the reason was the disagreement over what to call the Gulf of Mexico. That was their justification for denying AP journalists access to things like events in the Oval Office, even events on Air Force One. And this is going on since February.
It's just crazy to think that any perceived slight could result in excluding reporters like that. So it wasn't just those big press conferences, right? They were also barred from these smaller reporting pools. Can you explain to our listeners what those pools are and why access to them is so important?
Right. So these reporting pools are basically small groups of journalists who are chosen to cover events when space is limited. Then they share their reporting with all the other news organizations that couldn't be there. It's a way to make sure everyone gets the information, even when not everyone can physically be in the room. The AP has been a part of these pools for over a century,
Wow.
which really highlights how long they've been a part of the system and how their exclusion could disrupt the flow of information to tons of news outlets and ultimately to the public.
So this wasn't just about missing a press conference. This was about being shut out of a fundamental part of how the White House is covered, potentially affecting everyone's access to information. So after the judge ruled that this was unlawful, did the White House immediately let the AP reporters back in?
Not quite. The judge did put a temporary hold on his order to give the White House time to appeal the decision to a higher court. But here's the kicker. Even after the ruling came down, AP reporters were still denied access to at least one presidential motorcade. It almost felt like they were resisting the court's decision.
Which is kind of a big deal when you think about how the executive and judicial branches are supposed to interact and the expectation that court orders will be followed. It sounds like there were some interesting things that happened during the actual legal process, too.
Oh, absolutely. The AP presented a really strong case. They even had two of their senior White House journalists testify in open court. Meanwhile, the government representing the Trump administration didn't bring any witnesses at all to defend their actions.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, the judge specifically mentioned this huge difference in evidence presented. He said he found the AP's evidence and logic to be compelling, and that the AP had clearly suffered significant concrete harm from being excluded. It's wild that the government didn't even try to defend themselves.
So the government basically had no defense, and the AP had all this evidence to back up their claims. It seems like this whole thing, while it was about the First Amendment and freedom of the press, also kind of touches on these bigger issues about the Constitution in general, at least according to the source material we're looking at. Like, it makes you wonder if this was just a one-off thing or if it reflects a pattern of the government trying to overstep its boundaries to control information. Our source material actually talks about that a bit, doesn't it?
It does. The speaker in the source material brings up concerns about other constitutional rights that they felt were being tested during the Trump administration. Now, these weren't part of this specific First Amendment case, but they do raise some interesting parallels. For example, the speaker mentions the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process, specifically in the context of mass deportations. And they also bring up the Sixth Amendment's right to counsel, pointing to situations where lawyers were reportedly being blocked from entering federal buildings.
So they're essentially saying,
It almost feels like this case with the AP is being used as an example to raise a larger question about how constitutional principles were being treated during that time.
it's like this one case is shining a light on a potentially bigger trend. And the speaker even goes so far as to ask if any part of the Constitution felt truly safe during that period. And they even bring up a pretty unexpected example to make their point, the Third Amendment.
Yeah, that's the one about quartering soldiers in your home.
It does feel a little out of place in a conversation about press freedom.
It does at first.
Yeah.
But the speaker uses it as a way to illustrate a bigger idea. So the Third Amendment basically says the government can't force people to house soldiers in their homes during peacetime. And even during wartime, there are specific rules they have to follow. The speaker is saying that even those parts of the Constitution that we don't think about as much or that might not seem as relevant today are still setting important limits on what the government can and cannot do.
So the speaker is basically saying if we see one part of the Constitution potentially being disregarded, it raises concerns about whether other parts are also at risk.
Exactly. It's like a domino effect.
It makes us think about how all of our rights are connected and how important it is to protect all of them, not just the ones that are most popular or in the news at any given moment.
Right.
So let's recap what we've talked about. The main point of all this is that a federal judge, and remember, he was appointed by President Trump himself, ruled that the Trump administration violated the First Amendment by denying access to journalists from the Associated Press. And this was all because of a disagreement over what to call the Gulf of Mexico.
Exactly. And the judge made it clear that once the government decides to give journalists access to cover things, they can't just exclude certain journalists because they don't like what those journalists are writing or how they're choosing to report on things.
It makes you think about the implications for the public's ability to stay informed. If the government can pick and choose which reporters get access based on what are essentially minor disagreements or perceived slights, it could have a huge impact on what information actually reaches the public.
Right. It raises serious questions about the role of a free and independent press in a democracy. The idea that the government could use access as a reward for positive coverage or as a punishment for critical reporting is a scary thought. It could lead to self-censorship where journalists are afraid to report on certain things because they might lose access. And ultimately, that hurts everyone because it undermines the ability of the press to hold those in power accountable.
It's pretty alarming that something as simple as a name could set off this whole chain of events.
It really highlights the potential for a slippery slope. If they can restrict access over something as seemingly trivial as a name, what's next? What other editorial decisions could become reasons for excluding journalists in the future? And even though the Third Amendment might seem like a dusty old relic to somebody, this whole deep dive into the First Amendment reminds us that all our freedoms, even the ones that don't seem as relevant in our daily lives, are built on these important principles. And those principles need to be constantly protected and understood. We need to make sure the government stays within the boundaries set by the Constitution. It's about being vigilant and informed and making sure our rights are upheld.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.